There are alternatives to these blanket loan forgiveness programs that are being considered now. And we can target this forgiveness in a progressive way.
I'm Bethany McLean.
Did you ever have a moment of doubt about capitalism and whether greed's a good idea?
And I'm Luigi Zingales.
We have socialism for the very rich, rugged individualism for the poor.
And this is Capital Isn't, a podcast about what is working in capitalism.
First of all, tell me, is there some society you know that doesn't run on greed?
And most importantly, what isn't?
We ought to do better by the people that get left behind. I don't think we should kill the capital system in the process.
Student loan debt, it's something many of us are familiar with.
The amount of student loan debt Americans hold is at a record high.
Some 45 million borrowers have federal student loans for a total of over $1.6 trillion, according to a group called educationdata.org. So the headlines about President-elect Joe Biden possibly canceling up to $50,000 of it per person have been understandably big news.
It's holding people up. They're in real trouble. They're having to make choices between paying their student loan and paying their rent.
So Luigi, as an Italian, what do you think of the student loan situation in the U.S.? How screwed up is it?
Actually, I have to admit, as a student in Italy, I was admiring the fact that in the United States you could get a loan to study. However, we seem to have taken a good idea and brought to the worst possible outcome.
Explain that. What do you mean?
First of all, you're told that education is priceless. If you don't go to college, you're going to be screwed out for life. And nobody really monitors whether you can repay in the future. All these loans are guaranteed by the government. So the lenders has very little incentives or no incentives to check. And I'm sorry to say, university in general are at the party pushing everybody to go to school because that's increased their revenues. The other point, which I think got lost in the debate, but is pretty important, is we're in a world in which we are subsidizing demand for mostly good reasons, but we're subsidizing demand, and supply is very inelastic. Why? Because especially non-for-profit colleges, by not being non-profit maximizing, they're not very fast in responding to increasing prices. If you have a very inelastic supply and you push the demand up with subsidies, there is one obvious answer, economics 101, prices go up.
There really is an analogy between the student loan market and the mortgage market in the run-up to the financial crisis. Homeowners, too, would-be homeowners were told, you're doing the right thing. This is what all good Americans do. You're buying a home. This is Mom America and apple pie. And it's very much the same thing with student loans. Kids who arguably are less capable of assessing whether or not this really does make sense than a would-be home buyer are told, you're doing the right thing. Get yourself an education. Don't worry about going into debt. And the job market isn't going to be there to support it.
Yeah, I completely agree. The thing that is particularly painful for me is that the role of predatory lenders, the Angela Mozilla of the situation, are now us, the universities. As much as I would like to blame only for-profit colleges, I think all of us have benefited from this. Not enough of us has spoken aggressively against this because in part was benefiting us.
I was going to say you're more the Wall Street of the situation. Horrors. You're the ones figuring out how to make money from something that is going to cause a calamity both to the economy and to millions of Americans.
Yeah, and University of Phoenix is the Goldman Sachs of the situation, that is synthetically producing something that looks like a college degree, but is nothing of a college degree, but still costs like a college degree, and they profit from it.
So let's talk about this strange system that we have. I don't think I really understood it until I started covering. Actually, I wrote a piece on the old Sallie Mae back in the early 2000s in Fortune, because I was so stunned by this idea that Sallie Mae was a private company and advertised itself as a private company with shareholders and a bottom line and a stock price. And yet most of its business was actually guaranteed by the U.S. government because it made student loans that were guaranteed under this program passed in 1965 called the Higher Education Act, which created this federal family education loan program and basically reimburses student loans. And so there's that whole part of it. But then also we had this explosion in for-profit colleges who also are able to get their loans, the loans they extend guaranteed by the government. So you have this very odd and quite pernicious mix of for-profit institutions with shareholders to please and government guarantees. And that's almost always a bad situation. I remember back in the early 2000s when I was starting to cover Sallie Mae, a lot of short sellers were sure that the for-profit colleges were ripping students off and were destined to failure. And it's been a couple of decades of scandal after scandal involving the for-profit schools with overly aggressive marketing, et cetera, and terrible default rates. But the pushback from the people who were believers in these companies on Wall Street was always that these schools were offering an education to people who otherwise wouldn't be able to get one, who otherwise were locked out of the system. And it was a fascinating debate because it was hard to prove who was right for a lot of years. But I think now, given the default rates on loans made through for-profit colleges, I think the verdict is in. And for whatever reason, for-profit colleges seem to be a problematic enterprise.
Yeah, but even more than the default rates, because if you see just the high default rates, then you can try to blame the borrowers, not necessarily the schools. What I find even more damning, and here I rely on some research of my colleague Constantine Yannelis, who we're going to bring on the podcast momentarily, but some of his research shows that the median student in this college, so that's the 50% level of the student, doesn't gain anything in wages by attending college. So it's not only that they default, it's kind of surprising that they don't default even more, because if you don't gain anything and you take on more debt, you're bound to default. And in fact, for-profit colleges represent only 10% of the borrower, 20% of the debt, but 60% of the defaults. So they're not the only cause, but it's a big, big part of it.
Yeah, the numbers are pretty stunning. I think the reason why more students don't default is because the cost of defaulting is so incredibly punitive. You can't expunge your student loans in bankruptcy. And when I wrote about this for Fortune, I found a number of borrowers who still in retirement were having their Social Security income garnished for their student loan debt. And in a lot of cases now, what's happened is you've had parents guaranteeing their children's student loan debt, and those parents will now be on the hook for it and be on the hook for it going into their old age if their kids can't pay. So there's an enormous incentive, and it's an interesting back and forth on whether it's too punitive or appropriate to have it be that way. What do you think?
Having some ability to default under the extreme circumstances is very important for risk-sharing consideration. But all this emphasis, and I know it's probably the most popular, easy thing to do, but all this emphasis in low forgiveness is only making the problem worse in the future. If you have a leaked faucet, you should not collect the water. The first thing you should do is prevent the faucet from leaking, because otherwise, every water you collect, more water will come.
Colleges will still continue to accelerate their tuition costs, because why not? Once the government steps in and wipes out the debt, then why shouldn't the University of Chicago continue to encourage students to take out debt they can't afford? And why shouldn't for-profit colleges just continue their rampage through the population, because there's no cost to them?
Absolutely. Why students shouldn't say this actually is free, because with some probability at the next crisis, this is going to be forgiven. So let's borrow more and take the chance. And also because if I was prudent and I borrow less money and maybe I skip lunches and dinner during my college years, and I don't get my loan forgiven. So why did I suffer for nothing? I should actually add a party.
So let's bring in an expert who has written a lot about this to help us think through these issues. Constantine Yannelis, a former Treasury Department official in the Obama administration, who is now a colleague of Luigi's at the University of Chicago.
Great. Thanks for having me today. I'm very happy to talk about anything and everything related to student loans.
Beware what you wish for. So let me start with a simple question, which is, how did we get here? And this is, most people know that there are student loans, but probably most people are not aware of the magnitude of this market. How did we reach this level?
Absolutely. I think people are shocked by the numbers. We've seen a more than 600% growth in aggregate student loan volumes. We haven't seen that in any other loan market. According to the New York Fed, student loans have the highest delinquency rate of any form of consumer debt. That actually understates true non-repayment, because a lot of people are not repaying through programs like income-driven repayment. So it's actually a complicated question whether they end up paying more or less under income-driven repayment, because if they're not paying, interest accrues and the balance of the loan ends up growing, so they could end up paying more. I've actually done some work on this, and it turns out that it is a net negative in terms of repayment, but that'll end up meaning taxpayers will pick up some of the tab for these loans that aren't repaid. There are reasonable forecasts of the present value of the loan program. So in order to make those forecasts, we have to make assumptions about income growth if people are on income-based repayment. We also have to make assumptions about what future policy will be. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty about how big losses will be, but we estimate the present value of the loan program to be around $800 billion.
But so if the loans are of the order of 1.4 trillion, then you're talking about what, 600 billion of losses?
Yeah, in that order of magnitude.
Okay. Just to get a sense, I'm sorry, I don't want to hold you on to one particular number, but I think it's important. We're not nickel and dime billions here. We're trying to get an order of magnitude. The order of magnitude seems staggering.
It is very large.
I want to back up a little bit to the structure of the overall market, because you've written about this as well. Some portion of the problem that we have is the growth in for-profit colleges, right? How did that become part of the educational landscape? And are we at a place now where we can say this has been a bad thing, or this has been a good thing, or there are pros and cons of it?
Yeah, I would say that the bulk of the problem is due to for-profit colleges. So my numbers might be a little bit ballpark, but when I wrote one of my papers on this, for-profit colleges accounted for about 10% of all enrollment, about 20% of all student loan borrowers, and approximately half of all student loan defaults. And if you look at student loan defaults over time, they very closely track the share of students attending for-profit colleges. And I don't want to be overly negative on the idea of for-profit colleges. The problem is just the way that we've set up the incentive structure, for-profit maximizing schools. Because basically, if you're a hyper-rational school, you just want to make a profit. Because of these government loan programs, all you have to do is sign up students, get them to borrow, and then pay tuition. So if they end up defaulting on the loan, it's a taxpayer's problem. It's not your problem. So potentially we could design a better system, giving these for-profit colleges some skin in the game, making them on the hook for defaulted loans, or perhaps by doing something more innovative, having income share agreements where rather than paying tuition, students could pay a portion of their income to the school for a couple of years.
So can you explain to us why the incentives are structured in such a stupid way? In a sense, this is not something we discovered now. I've written 10 years ago. Bethany, believe it or not, wrote about 20 years ago. So this was completely foreseeable. Anybody with, I think, an undergraduate in economics will understand that the incentives are screwed up, and are particularly screwed up when you face somebody that is profit motivated. And says one great thing about non-profit motivated institution is they're not that fast to act in the positive and in the negative domain. Why have we left this problem in this situation for many years? In fact, why we doubled down on this? Because, as you said, this sector has increased tremendously in the last 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good question. And, I think there's a combination of kind of nice goals and bad. There's this view that we want to enroll more people in colleges. So there was some view that any policy that increases college enrollment is a good thing. So let's not worry about the returns or the value added. Then, of course, the more nefarious explanation is lobbying. A lot of these for-profits spend quite a lot of money lobbying the government. They're very influential. Prominent politicians have been on the board of various for-profit colleges.
Can we go a little more on the details of this market? Because if everything is guaranteed by the federal government, why so many of us pay such large interest rate on our loans?
The interest rates are set by Congress. So Congress just decides what student loan interest rates are each year. I mean, now lately they've been fixed. In the past, they've been variable, but they typically just track the federal funds rate plus the spread.
And that spread is heavily dictated by lobbying, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's lobbying per se, because remember, it's not really private companies that are making profit today, at least. I can only really speculate on how Congress is setting the interest rates. I mean, it's a large institution with many members, and they might have very different views on why they're setting interest rates one way or another. But if I had to speculate, I would just say that if student loan interest rates are above or below market rates, either the government program is making a lot of money or losing a lot of money, and hence will come under pressure either to not make too much money on paper from students or to not subsidize them too much. So my guess is that those are the political economy forces, but I'm speculating. I mean, in the past, there may have been more lobbying pressure because of the guarantee program, and then banks were making quite a bit of money.
No, but sorry, you're saying that basically 20% of the loans are terrible. They cost a lot, and then you share some of that cost with the other part of the distribution. In a sense, what the government is doing is giving away loans without a proper underwriting and charging the good guys for their own mistakes.
Yeah, that's true to some extent. Yeah.
But isn't that something that needs to be fixed? Because it's crazy that you have an asset that is guaranteed by the government, and so it should have now a year that is close to government debt. And we know that government debt as interest rate approaches zero, at least for the short maturities. So why many students have to pay such a large amount? And they have to pay because the government has given away money indirectly to other people. That is really super inefficient and unfair.
Yeah, absolutely. It's no private loan market would have a uniform interest rate for obvious reason. You also have different groups cross-subsidizing each other. For example, the default rate for women is much lower than the default rate for men. So effectively, by having this uniform interest rate, you have women subsidizing men.
But also, isn't there an industry in the fintech world that is picking and choosing the best borrower and basically cream scheming and dumping the rest on the government?
Yes, absolutely. So there are companies like SoFi and Common Bond, and that's exactly what they're doing. They're taking these borrowers from elite institutions. So SoFi initially, when they started, they would only take borrowers from certain programs at certain schools, right? If you go to the Stanford or Chicago MBA, nobody ever defaults on a loan. So if you can get them to borrow with you, they're a safe credit risk. So they were very small in the past, probably why they haven't received a lot of attention from regulators. They chose to actually expand in a very smart way, because if they had gone down the distribution, because you would keep playing this game on and on and on and go down and keep cream skimming more borrowers, my guess is that eventually this would have led to some kind of response, because the federal loan program would have become effectively a bad bank. So what SoFi did instead was they expanded, let's call it horizontally rather than vertically. They had this pool of very credit-worthy student loan borrowers, and they were their first creditor. So they started offering other types of loans to this pool of borrowers, mortgage loans, vehicle loans, so on and so forth. So that's the way they expanded rather than going down. So you're absolutely right. There's some cream skimming going on. Right now it's fairly small, although that could change in the future.
So to make sure that everybody follow, because maybe we went a little bit too fast. So these guys, what they're doing, they are lending money to Harvard graduates at a lower rate than the government, because Harvard graduates are so good that they don't default, but they are charged a rate that is above the rate that they should be charged.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, that makes the average borrower worse in the federal loan program, because the federal loan program is losing these very creditworthy borrowers who don't default.
But this, I think, is the essential problem of running a political goal inside a lending program, because you do two things. You want to cross-subsidize different categories in a way that is very unsustainable if you have an open market. So either you shut down the open market, or you resort to do the right thing, which is to subsidize through the fiscal instrument and let the market work. But I think that politicians want to hide some of the cost of these programs, and by hiding it, they do this complicated system that end up creating more leakages and more problems than the subsidy to begin with.
Yeah, that may be true. I don't want to speculate on politicians' motives, but that's quite possible.
If we do accept that we're not going to blow up the U.S. system, then are there things we can do, especially given the last, let's call it 2 decades of experience with for-profit colleges and experience with a student loan program in a modern economy? Are there things we can do that can remove some of the efficiencies and that can make the system work better for everybody, from taxpayers to students?
Absolutely. One thing we can do is fix this misalignment of incentives. Brazil recently, for example, they had a very similar problem with for-profit colleges. So this is very new, so it's hard to evaluate. But one thing they did was they made schools on the hook for a portion of defaulted dollars and to pay if students are receiving government aid and they end up dropping out. So it actually makes the school's bottom line contingent on student outcomes. There's also a more direct way to do it through income share agreements. This is basically an equity type contract where students pay a portion of their income rather than a debt contract. Now, of course, I don't want to come out strongly in favor of that in any way because there are other concerns with an income share agreement, namely it could function as a sort of tax and lead to a labor supply disincentive.
Sort of a modern day serf system, right? In a way that the people who are least able to afford it end up owing a chunk of their income for the rest of their lives. I mean, it's almost modern day indentured servitude, or at least it could become that.
We have income-driven repayment, but I wouldn't call it indentured servitude. We're talking about a contract with 10 or 15% of somebody's income for a set number of years. So I think indentured servitude is a little bit strong, and people would be able to break the contract through the courts or the bankruptcy system. It's very similar, though, to an income contingent loan contract, which we already have. The only difference is it's uncapped.
No, I agree with you, Constantine. When I wrote my book basically 10 years ago now, I had a chapter discussing exactly these issues. Income sharing agreement is very appropriate in a world in which the returns to education are becoming more asymmetric. In the past, everybody was benefited fairly homogeneously through education. Today, you see some people, particularly talented, who makes an enormous return, and many that makes nothing. And so having some form of repayment base of income is a way to share that risk. So I'm 100% with you on that dimension, but I got pushback when I wrote about this. Many people said, there are some limits. The impression is really not very well tested. So you can do a bit of that, but what is the limit? I agree with you, 10% does not seem too much. But, I don't think there is a bright rule that say below 20 you're fine, but if you go 21, it becomes slavery. I think that it is an open issue.
Yeah, I agree with that. And like any consumer loan market, this would need to be regulated. There are some experiments. For example, in Indiana, and also a couple of small companies are offering income share agreements now. To my knowledge, they aren't facing legal difficulties, but this is on a very small scale. I mean, some other companies, Lumni in Latin America, have pioneered this in Colombia and Peru. So there is some precedent. Now, it's questionable whether private market would work for income share agreements due to adverse selection, right? If there's both an equity and a debt market, one student knows that they're going to earn a lot and the other student knows that they're not going to earn a lot. Obviously, the student who will earn quite a bit in the future would want to select the debt contract, and the student who won't earn very much will want to select the equity contract and basically walk away.
But don't you think that we are already in a system like this, but softly? In a sense, a lot of private colleges, if you make a lot of money, they come after you and they ask, quote unquote, demand a big donation from you. And to be fair, a lot of very successful alumni have done that. So we are in a form of income-based repayment in which 99.9 repays close to nothing, and then 0.1 repays a huge amount.
But the 0.1 isn't doing it. The 0.1 is, quote, repaying. They're only acceding to the college's demands because they want to get their progeny into that school. So it's not as if it's a demand that you're forced to make. You do it to continue to perpetuate the inequality in our system that exists anyway, right?
I agree. I mean, there's some concerns with this donation-based model in that there is this incentive to donate to get children in. And of course, colleges have an incentive to keep this model going because they have a lot of money. It might solve this problem to have a direct income-based system. And I also want to point out that this is only the model at very elite institutions at the top, and this is functioning very well, right? The student loan default rates at places like the University of Chicago or Harvard or Stanford are close to zero. Almost nobody defaults at these institutions. And actually, most elite institutions now have no loans policies so that students can pay without going for loans. So this is really a problem not at the top end of the distribution. So One thing that I think is really important to mention, a lot of the current policy debate is focusing on loan forgiveness. And one thing that's missed is that we already have a very progressive loan forgiveness program. It's called income-driven repayment. So the way these income-driven repayment plans work is that borrowers pay, depending on the plan, 10 or 15% of their income above 150% of the poverty line. Then, again, depending on the plan, after 20 or 25 years, remaining loan balances are completely forgiven. So if somebody earns less than 150% of the poverty line consistently, they're very poor, they end up paying nothing on their student loan. So we already have some loan forgiveness built in. So when we're talking about loan forgiveness, we're really talking about loan forgiveness for those borrowers who are earning more and wouldn't qualify under the minimum threshold for income-driven repayment. And one thing that I think is important and often missed in the public policy debate is one alternative way of expanding loan forgiveness and making those benefits only accrue to low-income borrowers is raising this threshold for income-driven repayment. For example, rather than having it be 150%, you could have it be 200, 300, or 400%. And then you would avoid this problem of people with a lot of debt who earn a lot of money, like MDs, JDs, and MBAs, benefiting from this loan forgiveness. Because actually I have a new paper out on this. Universal loan forgiveness is an extremely regressive policy. More than $100 billion would go to the top decile of the income distribution, and less than $20 billion would go to the bottom decile of the income distribution. That's for the simple reason that people in the bottom of the income distribution often don't go to college. And if they did, they drop out or they've gone to community college. So there are alternatives to these blanket loan forgiveness programs that are being considered now.
So to summarize, even if we are going to take the shortcut, as we so often seem to do in this country, and just do loan forgiveness rather than tackle the underlying problems in the student loan market, there are ways we can be a lot smarter about it than what's being currently discussed in the headlines. Is that a fair summary?
Exactly. And we can target this forgiveness in a progressive way.
But Constantine, if President-elect Biden were to appoint you like czar of education, of the student loans, besides that, what would you do? How would you restructure this very complicated market?
So I would have a system that looks much more like the Australian system. I would put all borrowers into income-driven repayment and make that, if not mandatory, the default loan repayment option, and simplify the program, eliminate a lot of paperwork so borrowers aren't getting kicked off. This would provide insurance to borrowers. I would also try to align the incentives of schools and the borrowers by making schools on the hook for dropouts that were financed by federal dollars and default rates. I would also eliminate uniform interest rate pricing and have at least some risk-based pricing, so we don't have different groups cross-subsidizing each other, and so we don't encourage students to borrow to do degrees that don't have very high returns. It's a little bit crazy that under the current system, we have the same interest rate and the same cap for somebody doing a JD at Harvard and for somebody doing an English master's at the University of Phoenix. Of course, default rates are very different and returns are very different for these programs.
So we hope that President Biden will call you.
For sure.
Well, no, I'm not involved in any political campaigns.
Thank you so much for joining us, Constantine. This was really educational. No pun intended.
Thank you.
Pun intended.
Yeah, no, this was fantastic, Constantine. Thanks a lot.
That's really a pleasure to be here, and hopefully see you soon once this pandemic is over.
I hope so.
If you're enjoying the discussions Luigi and I are having on this show, there's another University of Chicago podcast network show you should also check out. It's called Not Another Politics Podcast. Not Another Politics Podcast provides a fresh perspective on the biggest political stories. It's not told through opinions and anecdotes, but rather through rigorous scholarship, massive data sets, and a deep knowledge of theory. So if you want to understand the political science behind the political headlines, then listen to Not Another Politics Podcast, part of the University of Chicago Podcast Network.
There is another aspect that I had not fully understood until we discussed with Constantine, and I find it fascinating. The way the college loan program is designed is that everybody gets the same rate regardless of the level of intrinsic risk. But then they try to break even in making loans. In so doing, there is a pretty significant redistribution between a group and another. So much so that now there is a pretty big industry of companies, mostly fintech companies, that are cherry picking the best borrower, taking that away from the pool of government subsidized loan, because government loans have a rate which is much higher than what they should do, let alone much higher than what everybody else is paying these days with the Fed having a very accommodating monetary policy. So given that the government is on the hook no matter what in this business, and it's if we want to subsidize marginal borrower, it's right to do it, but if you do it out of general funds, not out of the other participant in the program.
It's interesting because it's yet another analogy to the housing market, because the presence of Fannie and Freddie on a nationwide basis in the housing market, you have very much the same dynamic where a well-off borrower who arguably could get a lower rate is paying the same rate as a not so well-off borrower in a risky place. And that's actually been one of the most complicated facets of getting the Fannie and Freddie out of conservatorship and restructuring the housing market is, what do you do with this cross-subsidization that nobody likes to talk about, but is actually true in the mortgage market as well. And I was thinking when you talked that with the private fintech companies coming and pulling the borrowers out of this market, the taxpayers, I was going to say the government, but of course it's not the government, it's taxpayers, really are getting screwed 6 ways till Sunday, right? Because then the borrowers who help make the default rate lower and who help taxpayers' money get paid back are going to leave the program. I guess the only way you can do that is coming up with a way that subsidies for the other borrowers work, because the last thing you want, I think, is risk-based lending in the student loan market, where the very borrowers who lack the privilege to go to a Harvard and get a degree in economics are then also forced to pay many times a higher rate on their student loans than the other kind of borrowers. Then you're just exacerbating inequality in our system, right? The very inequality that an education is meant to help address. So I don't know. It can't be as simple an answer as risk-based lending.
You're absolutely right, but one simple answer is you have colleges take a first cut of the losses on the students. Then colleges would be more leery to admit students who are unlikely to benefit from the school. When it comes to mortgages and when it comes to students, and that's the analogy between the two, we know that these are massive markets in which the average consumer, the average borrower, is not that sophisticated. And so you want to put the burden of risk on the lender, because the lender is the sophisticated party and is the one that should decide whether you are worth investing or not worth investing. We should do that in education by having those colleges take the first 10 or 20% of the loss on all these mortgages.
I want to agree with you. I do agree with you theoretically. I don't agree with you practically, because I fear that practically speaking, what that would result in would be colleges clamping down and refusing to admit students who might be riskier propositions, thereby denying those students of their chance at an education. I think there has to be some kind of better system so that, again, whatever fix we end up with doesn't end up exacerbating inequality in America, thereby deepening the very wounds and divides that education was meant to help fix. And it seems to me that if colleges are going to bear part of the cost, they're just going to get very, very conservative about who it is that they admit. And that's going to make matters worse. Already, I found an interesting statistic from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that some 90% of Black students and some 72% of Latino students take out loans for college versus just 66% of white students. So you already have a divide here, and I worry that putting the burden on colleges putting the responsibility maybe on colleges to decide who gets loans and who doesn't, the solution is going to be worse than the problem itself.
I agree with you, and part of the solution, of course, is to make public colleges better and more affordable. What I admire always of the US system was the variety. So you have the private leading university, you have the community colleges, you have the very good state school in the middle. That variety, I think, has shrunk over time, and the state schools have lost some of their reputation and some of their funding. I think that that's a part that should be definitely be boosted.
Once again, I'm going to reference the housing market because I remember being really surprised when I was doing the research for my last book on the financial crisis that the consumer advocates in the run-up to the financial crisis, starting as early as the late 90s, were saying, no, don't give people access to credit because giving people access to credit that's going to kill them is worse than no credit at all. And it was actually the consumer advocates who were not saying, please, more mortgages. They were saying, no, don't give people mortgages they can't pay back. And it just gets to, once again, the fundamental issue here is that education in too many cases no longer delivers the payback that it's supposed to. If you're going to pay for it, it should give you a value on the other hand and in exchange. And somehow we've managed to decouple the cost of an education from the value that people get out of it. And we have to figure out a way to link those again.
Maybe it is possible and say what should be done is to reduce the burden of the debt to people who went to schools that are not adding any value to them, but then not to make this rewarding for people who went to the wrong schools is to eliminate those schools from the list of schools you can borrow against. So let's say that if you went to an online private college that charges you a lot and doesn't add a lot of value, you can get at least partial forgiveness of that loan, but in exchange, that school will not be in the list of authorized schools to get federal subsidies.
We already have some version of what you're talking about in the student loan market, at least we're supposed to. That if schools have too high a default rate, they're supposed to be excluded from access to the federally guaranteed loan program. The problem is that the default rate can be manipulated by allowing students to defer their loans. And there's also an income-based repayment program, which allows borrowers to pay only 10% of their discretionary income toward their loans. And an education department analysis just found that borrowers in that program will probably only repay about half of their debt.
But then this program is feasible because if you are basically doing systematic studies of incoming students and exiting students, you force every school to report this, and then you're gonna forgive the loans of the one who went to the worst school in terms of this ratio. But then you treat that forgiveness as default, so automatically, because of the existing law, they will be excluded from future loans. So that can help the situation.
Yeah, it could actually. And that might be one way around the way in which schools manipulate default rates. And that's one of the things I've always found the trickiest at looking at the student loan market is that because colleges can sort of, quote, manage their default rates by pushing students to enroll in forbearance, which temporarily relieves borrowers of the obligation to pay their loans, the numbers are really misleading. It's really hard to tell from looking at official default rates exactly how bad it is. And since default status is measured 3 years after a student enters repayment, a borrower who goes through forbearance and then defaults may not even get accounted in the official statistics. So the whole thing is so subject to gaming. I'm sure there's somebody inside the for-profit education business who figures out how to manipulate the default rates in order to make them look better so that the schools can keep access to federal funds.
I'm sure there is, and I'm sure it's paid pretty well for those services. There is an additional problem, in my view, is that as inequality increases, even among college graduates, the average or the median is not really your relevant statistics, particularly the average, because the average is made of a guy who makes bazillions and a guy who makes less than what he made 4 years ago. But also, in the more rich institutions, you have a form of redistribution from the super rich to the rest. So you have one Bill Gates who drop out of Harvard but donate a lot of money. That helps pay for some of the education of the others. In lower level colleges, you don't have this billionaire that do redistribution. Something that will get me fired from the University of Chicago, but I would say anyway, is maybe what we should do is tax some of those donation and redistribute them a bit across colleges. You know, if you donate 150 million, like Bloomberg donated to Johns Hopkins or Ken Griffin donated to Harvard, that donation is tax deductible for the donor, and the endowment accumulates tax-free for the institution. Okay, so there's a lot of tax advantage going on in the process. Maybe a little bit less of this tax advantage will help struggling colleges to help with their tuition. We have a increasing inequality also among colleges. The top 20 or 30 have become super rich, both because they had an endowment to begin with, and so had a phenomenal return on their endowment in the last 20 years, and because they got more and more donation from their successful students. And then short of that, they became much poorer. And so the question is to help the median student pay for his or her college. Maybe you need some redistribution, not only within a college, but also across colleges.
I like that idea. It's interesting because, of course, in many cases, the billionaire who is donating to his or her college is doing so not just out of the goodness of his or her heart, but also to get their children into that college. So it's actually a system that perpetuates a monarchy of sorts or an aristocracy of sorts in the U.S. because the billionaires who donate are kind of cost insensitive. They're giving that money so their progeny can get into Harvard. And so they may be willing to pony up the taxes as well and have that money dispersed across the system as long as it doesn't change their progeny's ability to get into their school of choice.
I would like to bring in another topic we have ignored so far, which is in all those calls to forgive the student loans now, there are two arguments that I find particularly problematic. The first one is, you do it because this stimulates the economy. And the second is, you do it because that's the only thing you can do it via executive order without consulting Congress. And so Biden should do it. And I find both these arguments extremely disturbing. The second one, because it's really anti-democratic. So you're saying, let's find the trick to do something that can be done without going through Congress. This is basically at the same level as Trump finding tricks to finance the wars without passing through Congress. To me, is bad in both cases. The second is, of course, having the economy grow is important, but I don't think it's the only criteria of economic policy. And in particular, you want to think about what are the long-term consequences of your decision and not just do the quick fix immediate and move on. An intervention not justified within a reform, but just an ad hoc intervention to forgive without any sort of fundamental reason will create more of that down the line. And it will create uncertainty about what loans are repaid, what loans are not repaid, and incentives to take more loans because you hope that eventually it will be repaid by the government and so on and so forth. So I think that the argument cannot be limited only on the impact on aggregate demand, which is a factor, but it's not the only factor.
Yeah, I think Constantine's argument that a policy of blanket student loan forgiveness is actually quite a regressive policy is a really interesting one. It's funny because you have progressives advocating for this idea, and I think not thinking it through and not realizing necessarily that it actually is quite a regressive policy, or maybe they do realize it.
Actually, I'm more cynical. I think that they do realize very well because today the progressive are the educated. And so the big divide is on colleges. Non-college educated are Republican, and the college educated are mostly Democrat. And so exactly like the Republican, decided to eliminate the tax deduction of state taxes. They knew that this will favor their states and their constituency against the Democrat, because most Democrats live in states that have higher state taxes. In the same way, the Democrats are doing the opposite. They are doing a policy that redistribute money from the non-college educated, who are the real losers of the 21st century, are the ones that are left behind by globalization and by technology. Basically, screw them and subsidize the successful one who got to college, and now they get it for free.
You are more cynical than I am, Luigi, but I think that actually could be right. Dare I say it? I think we've come out pretty firmly on the side of this blanket loan forgiveness being fairly stupid. Is that too blunt a word?
I think it's, let's say, not justified. What can be justified is a targeted program to forgive part or to reduce interest rate on others. And most importantly, make sure that this doesn't happen again. I think that we should do all these things together. And trying to find a shortcut of the executive order, I think it's a terrible idea.
And when you said that we should find ways to make this better, I couldn't help starting to laugh, because here we are 12 years now after the financial crisis, and the whole silver lining of the financial crisis was that we would figure out ways to make the mortgage market make more sense. And here we are 12 years after the financial crisis, and Fannie and Freddie are still in conservatorship, which was supposed to be temporary because our government cannot get it together enough to figure out what to do with them. and how to restructure this. And so I worry that actually making the student loan market make sense and figuring out how to make education work for everybody, which actually is one of the most important things the government could do. I worry that that's actually beyond us. At least if the mortgage market is a leading example, then you'd say it is beyond us to do anything remotely intelligent.
But part of the problem is that we separated fixing the damage of the crisis with fixing the housing market. Once the urgency of fixing the damages was gone, the usual vested interest prevailed and there was no reform. So what we should do with the student loan market is to say, we're going to have some relief conditional on fixing the problem now. And so the political benefits of the relief should come with the cost of doing the hard work of fixing the problem. If we do the relief, in fact, that's an extra reason not to do the relief in this way, because that will only guarantee that the problem will get worse in the future, because the political will to make a change will disappear.
So do universities, as the Wall Street of this crisis, have the lobbying power in Washington, D.C. that the big financial firms did to prevent that real work from being done? Are we going to see detachments from the University of Chicago heading to Wall Street in order to lobby their favorite senators?
I actually think that universities are pretty powerful lobbying organization. In the period in which we're still the pork barrel special items attached to the bill at the last moment, the university pioneered this technique. So don't underestimate the power of lobbying at universities, because they come with this gigantic positive aura around them, and so they're more effective in pushing their line.
Yep.
Capital Isn't is a podcast from the University of Chicago Stiegler Center in collaboration with the Chicago Booth Review. Also check out promarket.org, a publication of the Stiegler Center. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review to Capital Isn't wherever you get your podcasts.